The prestigious Galactic University of Cultural Studies stood tall against the purple sky of planet Nexus, its crystalline spires reflecting the light of 3 moons. Inside one of its many lecture halls, Professor Reed adjusted his tie as he prepared to welcome the newest batch of alien exchange students to his Human Studies 101 class. Among the diverse group of extraterrestrial students sat Clara, a bright-eyed student from the Seasonal Species Alliance. Her iridescent scales shifted colors with each movement, a natural trait of her species that helped attract mates during their strictly regulated breeding season. She had specifically chosen to study humans, fascinated by their unusual ways and eager to learn more about Earth's dominant species. The professor cleared his throat and began his lecture. Welcome, everyone, to Human Studies 101. Today, we'll begin with human reproductive biology and social structures, as these aspects often cause the most confusion among non-human species. Clara leaned forward, her antennae twitching with interest. She had already studied several species across the galaxy, and all of them had clear, biologically determined mating seasons. It was simply the natural order of things, a time when males would display their colors, perform their rituals, and compete for female attention. As Professor Reed displayed a holographic timeline of human reproduction, Clara's scales shifted to a confused yellow. She raised her upper appendage, unable to contain her question. Professor, I apologize for interrupting, but there seems to be an error in your presentation. I don't see the designated mating season marked anywhere on the timeline. The professor smiled, having expected this question. That's because humans don't have one, Clara. Human males are capable of mating year-round, and human females have monthly cycles rather than seasonal ones. The lecture hall erupted with chittering, clicking, and various other sounds of surprise from the alien students. Clara's scales flashed a brilliant white, the color of shock in her species. But how do males know when to begin their mating displays? When do they change their coloring? How do females select the most suitable mates without a standardized competition period? Professor Reed replied, his smile widening, that's where human culture becomes particularly fascinating. You see, humans have developed complex social structures and courtship rituals that aren't bound by biological seasons. They can pursue romantic relationships at any time, using various social cues and personal preferences to find compatible mates. Clara's data pad clattered to the floor as she struggled to process this information. In her species, males turned brilliant blue once a year, built elaborate nests, and performed synchronized dances to attract females. The idea of a species choosing their own timing for reproduction seemed chaotic, almost impossible to manage. But the resource management, she blurted out, her scales now cycling through multiple colors in rapid succession. How does a society function without synchronized reproduction? How do they plan for population growth? For resource allocation? The professor's eyes twinkled with amusement. This was exactly why he loved teaching this course, the moment when alien students first began to grasp just how different humans could be from their own species' carefully regulated biological patterns. Those are excellent questions, Clara, he said, and they'll lead us perfectly into our next topic, human social structures and family planning. But first, would anyone like to guess how human males attract mates without seasonal color changes? The lecture hall filled with increasingly wild theories, while Clara sat back in her seat, her mind racing with possibilities. Humans were proving to be far more complex and fascinating than she had imagined, and this was only the first day of class. After class, Clara hurried to the university's digital library, her scales still flickering between shades of confusion and excitement. She needed to understand more about these fascinating humans and their seemingly chaotic reproduction patterns. As she settled into a study pod, she noticed another student from her class, a crystalline being named PX, whose transparent body refracted light like a living diamond. Mind if I join you? PX asked, their crystalline form humming with curiosity. I'm just as puzzled as you are about these humans. In my species, we only merge our crystal matrices once every 50 years when the stellar radiation peaks. Clara welcomed the company, and together they began diving into the human database. The more they read, the more astonished they became. Videos and articles showed humans engaging in courtship behaviors in all seasons, during snow, under burning summer suns, in spring rain, and autumn winds. Look at this, Clara pointed to a historical document. They even have multiple cultural celebrations around pair bonding throughout their calendar year. Something called Valentine's Day in winter, traditional wedding seasons in summer, but none of these are biologically mandatory. PX's crystal structure vibrated with amazement. And their courtship rituals. They're so varied. Some humans use digital applications to find mates, others meet through social gatherings, work environments, or educational institutions. There's no standardized protocol at all. As they continued their research, Professor Reed walked by their study pod. Noticing their intense focus, he stopped to observe. Clara looked up, her scales shifting to a respectful purple. "Professor, we have so many questions. How did humans evolve such a flexible mating system? Doesn't it create social chaos?" The professor pulled up a chair. "Actually, it's one of humanity's greatest evolutionary advantages. This flexibility allowed them to adapt to various environments and circumstances. While other species were bound by rigid mating seasons, humans could reproduce year-round, allowing them to recover from disasters, adapt to different climates, and expand across their planet." "But the energy expenditure!" Clara exclaimed. "In my species, males save their energy all year for one magnificent display season. Human males must be exhausted maintaining constant mating readiness." Professor Reed chuckled. "That's another fascinating aspect. Human courtship isn't just about biological displays. They've developed complex social, emotional, and intellectual attributes that factor into mate selection. Some humans might never engage in traditional mating behaviors at all, focusing instead on other life pursuits." PX's crystal structure briefly clouded with confusion. "You mean, they can choose not to mate? Even when they're physically capable?" "Exactly," the professor nodded. "Human society has evolved beyond pure biological imperatives. They can choose their paths, their partners, and their timing. It's part of what makes them such a resilient and adaptable species." Clara's scales shifted to a deep blue of contemplation. She'd come to study humans expecting to find them primitive compared to the carefully regulated reproduction of other species. Instead, she was discovering that their seemingly chaotic system might actually be more advanced. "Professor," she said slowly, her antenna twitching with sudden inspiration, "I'd like to propose a research project. A comparative study of human mating flexibility versus seasonal species reproductive strategies. Maybe what we see as chaos is actually freedom." Professor Reed's eyes lit up. "Now that, Clara, sounds like an excellent research topic. And I have a feeling your findings might challenge quite a few preconceptions about human biology." As the professor left, Clara and PX shared excited looks. They had come to study humans, but they were beginning to suspect they might learn something about their own species in the process. The apparent chaos of human reproduction wasn't chaos at all, it was adaptation, resilience, and choice all rolled into one. A week into their research project, Clara and PX received approval to conduct field observations at the university's Human Exchange Student Center. Their scales and crystals respectively trembled with anticipation as they entered the bustling common area, datapads ready to record their observations. The space was filled with human students who had come to Nexus for their own cultural exchange programs. Clara was immediately struck by the variety of interactions she witnessed. Some humans sat close together, showing clear signs of potential mate interest, while others maintained purely platonic social bonds, all simultaneously, all without any biological seasonal triggers. "Look there," PX whispered, their crystal structure catching the light as they pointed toward a human male. Bringing a beverage to a female. Is that a mating ritual in progress? Clara consulted their research notes. Possibly. Although humans call it dating, it's a preliminary courtship phase that may or may not lead to actual mating. Fascinating how they invest energy in potential mates without any guarantee of reproduction. As they observed, a human student named Tom noticed their intense scrutiny and approached their observation post. "Hey there. I couldn't help but notice you taking notes. Are you doing research on us?" Clara's scales flickered briefly to embarrassed orange before she composed herself. "Yes, we're studying human reproductive flexibility for Professor Reed's class. Would you be willing to answer some questions?" Tom pulled up a chair, looking amused. "Sure, why not? Though I have to warn you, dating and relationships are complicated even for us humans." PX's crystalline form vibrated with excitement. "That's exactly what we want to understand. How do you handle the constant energy drain of being mate-ready year-round? In my species, we spend decades gathering energy for a single fusion event." Tom nearly choked on his drink, trying not to laugh. "It's not really like that. We don't spend all our time thinking about mating or looking for partners. We have jobs, hobbies, friends. Dating is just one part of life." Clara's antenna twitched as she rapidly took notes. "But without a designated season, how do you know when to begin seeking a mate? What triggers the search?" "There's no specific trigger," Tom explained, rubbing his neck thoughtfully. "Sometimes you meet someone and feel a connection. Other times you might focus on your career or personal growth instead. It's really up to each individual." As they talked, another human student named Amy joined their discussion. She smiled warmly at Tom before turning to the alien researchers. "Are you asking about human dating? Because I have some thoughts about how dating apps have changed everything." Clara's scales shifted to an intrigued green. "Dating apps? You mean the digital mate selection tools? We read about those but couldn't quite understand their purpose." Amy pulled out her phone, showing them a popular dating app's interface. "See, it lets you connect with potential partners based on shared interests, values, and attractions. It's like having a year-round mating season in your pocket, but without any pressure to actually mate." PX's crystal structure briefly clouded with confusion. "But if the biological drive isn't timing these interactions, what is? How do humans prevent total social chaos?" Tom and Amy exchanged knowing looks. "We have something better than biological timing," Amy explained. "We have choice, consent, and communication. Sure, there's still attraction and chemistry, but we get to decide when and if we want to pursue those feelings." Clara's scales rippled with sudden understanding. "So the very thing we thought was a weakness, the lack of a clear mating season, is actually a strength," Tom finished. "It means we can focus on compatibility beyond just biological triggers. We can build relationships based on personality, shared goals, and genuine connection." As they concluded their field observations for the day, Clara and PX had filled several datapads with notes. What had started as a simple comparison of reproductive strategies was evolving into a deeper study of how freedom from biological constraints had shaped human social evolution. Walking back to their dormitory, Clara's scales settled into a thoughtful blue. "You know, PX," she said quietly, "I'm beginning to think we're not just studying human reproduction. We're studying human freedom." During their third week of research, Clara received an urgent message from home that sent her scales into a frenzied color display. Her younger brother had entered his first mating season early, throwing their entire family's carefully planned schedule into disarray. As she shared the news with PX in the library, her scales couldn't settle on a single color. "The timing is all wrong," she fretted, pacing back and forth. "He's supposed to wait another 2 cycles. Now the family resources are stretched thin, the ceremonial display grounds aren't ready, and half our relatives can't make it to witness his color change. PX's crystalline form dimmed sympathetically. Can't they just postpone it? Postpone a mating season? Clara's scales flashed incredulous purple. That's not how biology works. Or at least, I thought it wasn't. Tom and Amy, who had become regular contributors to their research, found them in this state of distress. After hearing about the situation, Amy pulled up a chair. You know, this reminds me of my sister's wedding. The venue cancelled 3 days before the ceremony. Clara's antenna perked up with interest, momentarily distracted from her worry. Wedding? That's one of your formal mating ceremonies, correct? What happened? Well, Amy smiled. Instead of following the traditional plan, they had a small ceremony in our parents' backyard. It wasn't what they originally wanted, but it ended up being more personal and meaningful. Tom nodded. That's the thing about humans, we're pretty good at adapting when things don't go according to plan. No offense, but having everything tied to strict biological schedules seems really stressful. But how do you maintain order? Clara asked, her scales shifting to a confused yellow. In my species, the mating season synchronizes everything: resource allocation, social gatherings, even career advancement. Without that structure, we make our own structure, Tom explained. But it's flexible. We can adjust it when we need to. Professor Reed, who had been quietly observing from nearby, joined the conversation. Clara, remember how we discussed human adaptability? Perhaps this situation with your brother provides an unexpected research opportunity. Clara's scales rippled with curiosity. What do you mean, Professor? Well, you're studying how humans manage without a mating season. But maybe the more interesting question is, how did humans create social structures that work without being tied to biological imperatives? PX's crystal structure brightened. Like how they developed multiple acceptable paths for finding mates, rather than having just one rigid system? Exactly, the professor smiled. Humans had to develop more complex social structures precisely because they weren't constrained by biological timing. They needed to create systems that could work at any time, for any individual. Clara began taking notes frantically, her scales settling into a deep blue of concentration. So when my brother's early mating season disrupts our family's plans, it highlights the potential advantages of a more flexible system, Amy finished. In human society, he could simply wait until the family was ready to celebrate, or adapt the celebration to fit the current circumstances. But wouldn't that be? Clara's scales flickered as she searched for the right word: chaotic? Tom laughed kindly. Life is chaotic sometimes, no matter what species you are. Humans just learn to roll with it better because we had to. As Clara processed this perspective, she received another message from home. Her mother had apparently organized an emergency family gathering through virtual presence technology, ensuring all relatives could witness her brother's color change ceremony, even if not physically present. Look at that, Professor Reed pointed out. Your family is already adapting, finding new solutions to biological constraints. Perhaps your species and humans aren't so different after all, you're both capable of innovation when circumstances demand it. Clara's scales shifted to a warm shade of gold, the color of new understanding. What had started as a crisis was transforming into a profound insight for her research. Perhaps the true strength of any species lay not in their biological systems, but in their ability to adapt when those systems faced unexpected challenges. The university's annual Xenobiology conference was approaching, and Clara and PX had been selected to present their research findings. As they prepared in the bustling conference hall, Clara's scales shifted between nervous orange and excited green, while PX's crystal structure sparkled with anticipation. Their presentation room was filled with academics from across the galaxy, floating gas beings, silicon-based life forms, and even a group of collective consciousness entities sharing a single physical form. Professor Reed sat in the front row, giving them an encouraging nod. "Ready?" PX whispered as Clara activated their holographic display. "As ready as I'll ever be," Clara replied, her scales settling into a professional shade of blue. She began their presentation with a surprising image, a split screen showing her brother's mating season ceremony alongside Amy's sister's impromptu backyard wedding. "Esteemed colleagues," she addressed the diverse audience, "when we began this research, we thought we were studying a biological disadvantage in human reproduction. Instead, we discovered something remarkable: the power of reproductive freedom." The audience stirred with interest as PX continued, their crystal form refracting light across the room. "Most species in our galaxy, including our own, are bound by strict biological cycles. We believe this was the only way to ensure successful reproduction and social stability." Clara advanced to their next slide, showing various human couples in different settings and seasons. Humans, however, have evolved beyond these constraints. Their year-round reproductive capability isn't chaos, it's ultimate adaptability. From the audience, a gaseous being formed a question mark shape. But how do they manage resource allocation? How do they prepare for population growth without synchronized breeding cycles? Tom and Amy, who had helped with the research, stood up from their seats. "May we?" Tom asked. Clara nodded gratefully. "Instead of one system, we have many," Amy explained. "Some humans choose to have children in spring, others in winter. Some choose not to have children at all. Our society adapted to support all these choices. But the energy expenditure," called out a silicon-based scientist. "How do human males maintain constant reproductive readiness?" Clara's scales rippled with amusement as she remembered asking the same question. "That's where we made our first mistake, assuming that biological readiness equals constant mate-seeking behavior. Humans have developed something far more sophisticated." She displayed their research data, showing how human societies had evolved complex social structures, emotional bonds, and cultural practices that went far beyond simple reproductive drives. They can choose when, how, and if they want to pursue relationships. This freedom has led to remarkable innovations in social organization. PX projected a series of charts showing how human societies had developed various support systems, from dating apps to social events, from career advancement opportunities to family planning services. Their adaptability extends beyond reproduction to their entire social structure. "But the most fascinating discovery," Clara continued, her scales glowing with enthusiasm, "came from my own family's recent experience." She shared the story of her brother's early mating season and how her family had adapted using technology and flexibility, something they'd learned from studying humans. The audience was captivated. The collective consciousness entities merged into a single thought bubble of appreciation. Even the most skeptical scientists were leaning forward in their seats. In conclusion, Clara stated, "Her scales now a confident gold, what we once saw as a evolutionary weakness in humans is actually their greatest strength. Their reproductive freedom has forced them to develop more sophisticated, flexible, and resilient social systems than any seasonally bound species." As they finished their presentation, the hall erupted in various forms of alien applause, from light flashes to gravity waves to harmonic crystalline resonances. Professor Reed beamed with pride from the front row. A senior xenobiologist floated forward, their ethereal form glowing with interest. "This research could have profound implications for how we view biological adaptation and social evolution. Perhaps it's time for all species to learn from human flexibility." After their successful presentation at the Xenobiology conference, Clara found herself in the university's botanical gardens, her scales shifting through gentle waves of thoughtful blue. The garden's artificial atmosphere created a perfect replica of her home world's environment, complete with floating luminescent spores that danced in the artificial breeze. PX found her there, their crystalline form catching the light of the setting suns. "There you are. Everyone's been looking for you. The conference committee wants to publish our research in the Galactic Scientific Journal." But Clara seemed distracted, her antenna twitching with inner turmoil. "PX, I received another message from home. Remember my brother's early mating season? It failed. No mate selected him." PX's crystal structure dimmed sympathetically. "Oh no. In your culture, that means..." "Yes," Clara's scales dulled to a mournful gray. "He'll have to wait another full cycle before he can try again. A whole year of his life, wasted, because of biological timing he can't control." They were joined by Tom and Amy, who had noticed their friend's absence from the post-conference celebration. Amy sat beside Clara on the bioluminescent bench. "Want to talk about it?" Clara's scales flickered with emotion. "In all our research about human reproductive freedom, I never truly understood what it meant until now. My brother is brilliant, kind, and would make an excellent partner. But because his colors didn't shine quite bright enough, because his dance wasn't perfect enough for this season's available females." "That sounds really tough," Tom said softly. "In human society, he'd have time to recover, try different approaches, maybe work on himself first." "Exactly." Clara's scales flashed with sudden intensity. "He's being judged solely on one performance, in one specific time frame. How is that fair? How is that an effective way to find genuine compatibility?" Professor Reed, who had been tending to some earth plants in a nearby section of the garden, approached their group. "You know, Clara, this reminds me of something from Earth's evolutionary history." The professor gestured to a patch of flowers. "Many earth plants still operate on strict seasonal cycles for blooming and reproduction. But humans evolved beyond such constraints. It wasn't easy, it required significant biological and social adaptation. But that freedom allowed them to develop something remarkable." "What's that?" PX asked, their crystal structure brightening with curiosity. "The ability to choose," Amy answered. "Not just when to seek a partner, but who that partner should be, and why. The freedom to base relationships on more than just biological timing or physical displays." Clara's scales shifted to a new color, one her friends hadn't seen before. "That's what's been bothering me. Our research focused so much on the biological and social aspects, but we barely touched on the emotional impact of these different systems." "What do you mean?" Tom asked. "In my species, we say our mating season system is perfect because it's efficient, organized, predictable. But looking at my brother's situation, is it really perfect? Or is it just limiting?" PX's crystal structure pulsed with realization. "Are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that maybe it's time for my species to learn from humans," Clara said, her scales settling into a determined gold. "Not to abandon our biological cycles, we can't change those. But to create more flexibility in how we handle them. To develop support systems for those who don't succeed in their first season. To value compatibility over performance." Professor Reed smiled proudly. "Now that sounds like a fascinating follow-up research proposal." As the group sat in the garden, watching the artificial sun set, Clara felt a profound shift in her understanding. What had begun as a simple comparative study of reproductive biology had evolved into something far more meaningful, a challenge to the very foundations of how her society approached relationships, compatibility, and choice. 1 year later, Clara stood before the Seasonal Species Alliance Council, her scales radiating a confident gold as she prepared to present her revolutionary proposal. The chamber was filled with representatives from various seasonal species, including her own people's High Council. PX sat in the observation gallery, their crystal structure gleaming with supportive light, alongside Professor Reed, Tom, and Amy, who had traveled from Nexus for this moment. "Honored council members," Clara began, her voice steadied despite her racing hearts. "A year ago, I was just a student shocked to learn that humans had no mating season. Today, I stand before you with evidence that this apparent chaos might hold the key to our own evolution." She activated a holographic display showing the success rates of traditional seasonal mating compared to more flexible approaches some colonies had begun testing based on her research. "My own brother's failed mating season inspired this study. But he's not alone. Our data shows that 20% of our young fail their first season, with many waiting years before finding a compatible mate, not because they're unsuitable partners, but because our rigid system gives them only one chance per cycle to prove their worth." Murmurs rippled through the chamber. One of the council members, an elderly female with magnificently iridescent scales, leaned forward. "Are you suggesting we abandon our biological cycles? That's impossible." "No," Clara replied, her scales shifting to a reassuring blue. "Our biological cycles are part of who we are. But after studying humans, I've learned that biological constraints don't have to mean social constraints. We can create support systems, alternative pathways, and multiple opportunities for connection while still respecting our natural rhythms." She shared footage from her brother's recent success story. After his failed season, he had joined one of her pilot programs, a year-round social group for those preparing for their next season. There, he had met his future mate long before their biological cycles aligned. They had time to know each other, to build compatibility beyond mere color displays and ritual dances. When their seasons finally synchronized, Clara explained, they didn't need the traditional competition. They had already chosen each other based on genuine connection. Their color displays and dances became a celebration of their commitment, not a test of their worth. Professor Reed stood up in the gallery. "If I may, council members. What Clara has discovered is not just about reproduction. It's about resilience. Humans developed their flexibility out of necessity, but it gave them something precious, the ability to adapt, to choose, to find love and connection in their own time." Tom and Amy stepped forward, holding hands. "Our species wasn't always this way," Amy added. "We evolved, both biologically and socially. Our freedom to choose when and how to find partners didn't weaken our bonds, it strengthened them." The council chamber filled with discussion, scales and appendages and various biological features shifting in thoughtful consideration. Finally, the head council member spoke. "This is unprecedented. But so was the idea of interstellar travel once. So was the concept of cross-species education. Perhaps it's time for another evolution." Clara's scales rippled with joy as the council voted to implement her proposals across all willing colonies. Her research would help create support systems for those between seasons, social structures that allowed for year-round relationship building, and recognition that mate selection could be about more than just biological timing. As she left the chamber, surrounded by her friends from different species and worlds, Clara reflected on how far she'd come from that first shocked moment in Professor Reed's classroom. "You know," she said to PX, her scales shimmering with happy colors, "humans really are remarkable. They turned their biological constraints into freedom. Their chaos into choice. And now they've helped us see that we can do the same. That's humanity for you," Professor Reed smiled. "Always surprising the galaxy by showing us that what we think of as fixed might just be the beginning of something new." Looking out at the stars through the chamber's crystal windows, Clara knew that this was just the beginning. Her species wouldn't abandon their biological cycles, but they would no longer be limited by them. They had learned perhaps the most important lesson humanity had to teach, that true adaptation meant finding freedom within their constraints, and that love, in all its forms, couldn't be bound by seasons.